Hi, hello. So, as it says, it's time for a book video. I haven't done it in a long time. Where I left it last was she noticed that the stream was starting to get smaller. She emerged from the bushes and the stream reappeared. Trisha followed it with her head down and a scowl on her face, as intent as Sherlock Holmes following prints left by the hound of the Baskerville. She didn't notice the change in the underbrush, from bushes to ferns, nor the fact that many of the trees through which the little stream now wove its way were dead, nor the way the ground under her feet had begun to soften. All of her attention was focused on the stream. She followed it with her head down, a study in concentration. The stream began to spread again, and for 15 minutes or so, this was around noon, she allowed herself to hope that it wasn't going to peter out after all. Then she realized it was also growing more shallow. It really wasn't much more than a series of puddles, most dulled with pond scum and hopping with bugs. 10 minutes or so later, her sneaker disappeared through ground that wasn't solid at all, but only a deceptive crust of moss over a soupy pocket of mud. It flowed over her ankle, and Trisha drew her foot back with a little cry of disgust. The quick, hard yank pulled her sneaker halfway off her foot. Trisha uttered another cry and held onto the trunk of a dead tree while she first wiped her foot with snatches of grass and then put her sneaker back on. With that done, she looked around and saw she had come to a kind of ghost woods, the site of some old fire. Ahead, and already around her, was a broken maze of long dead trees. The ground in which they stood was swampy and wet. Rising from flat pools of standing water were turtle-back hummocks covered with grass and swatches of weeds. The air hummed with mosquitoes and danced with dragonflies. Now there were more woodpeckers tack-hammering away, dozens of them by the sound. So many dead trees, so little time. Trisha's brook wandered away into this morass and was lost. "What do I do now, huh?" she asked in a teary, tired voice. "Will somebody please tell me that?" So I'm kind of imagining the bog or this swamp of stench. I think it's called the bog from Labyrinth. That's kind of what I'm picturing. There were lots of places to sit and think about it. Tumbles of dead trees everywhere, many still bearing scorch marks on their pallid bodies. The first one she tried, however, gave beneath her weight and sent her spilling to the mucky ground. Trisha cried out as dampness soaked through the seat of her jeans. God, she hated having her seat get wet like that. And lurched upright again. The tree had rotted through in the damp. The freshly broken ends squirmed with wood lice. Trisha looked at them for a moment or two in revolted fascination, then walked to a second downed tree. This one she tested first. It seemed solid, and she sat on it warily, looking out at the bog of broken trees, absently rubbing her sore neck and trying to decide what she should do. Although her mind was less clear than it had been when she woke up, a lot less clear, there still seemed to be only two choices: stay put and hope rescue would come, or keep moving and try to meet it. She supposed that staying in one place made a certain amount of sense. Conservation of energy and all that. Also, without the stream, what would she be going toward? Nothing, sure, and that was for sure. She might be heading towards civilization. She might be heading away from civilization. She might even get walking in a circle. On the other hand, "There's always the other hand, sugar," her father had once told her. There was nothing to eat here. It stank of mud and rotting trees, and who knew what other gross stuff here. It was ugly here. It was a bummer here. It came to Trisha that if she stayed here, and no search party came before dark, she would be spending the night here. It was an awful idea. The little crescent-shaped clearing had been Disneyland compared to this. She stood and peered in the direction the stream had been tending before it petered out. She was looking through a maze of gray tree trunks and lacings of dry, jutting branches, but she thought she could see green beyond them. A rising green. Maybe a hill. And more checkerberries? Hey, why not? She had already passed several more clumps of bushes loaded with them. She should have picked them and put them in her pack, but she had been concentrating so hard on the stream that it just hadn't occurred to her to do so. Now, however, the stream was gone, and she was hungry again. Not starving, not yet at least, but hungry, sure. Trisha took 2 steps forward, tested a patch of soft ground, and watched with profound misgivings as water promptly seeped up around the toe of her sneaker. Was she going in there, then? Simply because she thought she saw the other side? There could be quicksand, she muttered. That's right, the cold voice agreed at once. It sounded amused. Quicksand! Alligators! Not to mention little gray X-Files men with probes to stick up your butt. Trisha gave back the pair of steps she had taken and sat down again. She was gnawing at her lower lip without realizing it. She now hardly noticed the bugs swarming around her. Go or stay? Stay or go? What got her going 10 minutes or so later was blind hope, and the thought of berries. Hell, she was ready to try the leaves now, too. Trisha saw herself picking bright red berries on the slope of a pleasant green hill, looking like a girl in a schoolbook illustration. She had forgotten the mud pack on her face and the snarled, dirty spout of her hair. She saw herself picking her way to the crest of the hill, filling her pack with checkerberries, finally reaching the top, looking down, seeing a road. I see a dirt road with fences on both sides, horses grazing, and a barn in the distance, a red one with white trim. Crazy, totally bazonka. Or was it? What if she was sitting half an hour's walk from safety, still lost because she was afraid of a little goo? Okay, she said, standing up again and nervously readjusting the straps of her pack. Okay, berries, ho. But if it gets too gross, I'm going back. She gave the straps one final tug and started forward again, walking slowly over the increasingly wet ground, testing each step as she went, detouring around the skeletal standing trees and the fallen tangles of deadwood. Eventually, it might have been half an hour after starting forward again. It might have been 45 minutes. Trisha discovered what thousands, perhaps even millions, of men and women before her have discovered. By the time it gets too gross, it's often also too late to go back. She stepped from an oozy but stable patch of ground onto a hummock that wasn't a hummock at all but only a disguise. Her foot went into a cold, viscous substance that was too thick to be water and too thin to be mud. She tilted, grabbing a jutting dead branch, screamed in fright and vexation when it snapped off in her hand. She fell forward into long grass that hopped with bugs. She got a knee under her and yanked her foot back. It came with a loud, sucking plop, but her sneaker stayed down there someplace. No! She yelled, loud enough to scare a big white bird into flight. It exploded upward, trailing long legs behind it as it became airborne. In another place and time, Trisha would have stared at this exotic apparition with breathless wonder, but now the bird barely registered. Ironic, since this part of the video has the bird wall. She turned around on her knees, her right leg covered with shining black muck up to the knee, and plunged her arm into the water-welling hole which had temporarily swallowed her foot. "You can't have it!" she shouted furiously. "It's mine, and you can't have it!" She felt around in the cold murk, fingers tearing through membranes of roots or dodging between those too thick to tear. Something that felt alive pressed briefly against her palm, and then was gone. A moment later, her hand closed over her sneaker and she pulled it out. She looked at it. A black mud shoe, just right for an all-over mud girl. The very thing! The total puppy shits, Pepsi would have said. And began to cry again. She lifted the sneaker up, tilted it, and a stream of grunge ran out of it. That made her laugh. For a minute or so she sat on the hammock with her legs crossed and the rescued sneaker in her lap, laughing and crying at the center of a black orbiting universe of bugs, while the dead trees stood sentinel all around her and the crickets hummed. At last her weeping tapered to sniffles, her laughter choked in somehow humorless giggles. She tore handfuls of grass out of the hammock and wiped the outside of the sneaker as well as she could. Then she opened her pack, tore up the empty lunch bag, and used the pieces as towels to swab out the inside. These pieces she balled up and threw indifferently behind her. If someone wanted to arrest her for littering this butt-ugly, bad-smelling place, just let them. She stood up, still holding the rescued sneaker in her hand, and looked ahead. "Oh, fuck," Trisha croaked. It was the first time in her life she had said that particular word out loud. Pepsi said it sometimes, but Pepsi was Pepsi. She could now more clearly see the green she had mistaken for a hill. It was hummocks, that was all. Just more hummocks. Between them was more standing, stagnant water, and more trees, most dead but some with fluffs of green at the top. She could hear frogs croaking. No hill. From bog to swamp. Bad to worse. She turned and looked back but could no longer tell where she had entered this purgatorial zone. If she thought to mark the place with something bright, a piece of her nasty old shredded poncho, say, she might have gone back. But she hadn't, and that was that. You can go back anyway. You know the general direction. Maybe, but she wasn't going to follow the kind of thinking that had gotten her into this mess in the first place. Trisha turned toward the hummocks and the blurry glints of sun on scummy standing water. Plenty of trees to hold on to, and the swamp had to end somewhere, didn't it? You're crazy to even think about it. Sure. It was a crazy situation. Trisha stood a moment longer, her thoughts now going to Tom Gordon and that special stillness of his. It was how he stood on the mound, watching one of the Red Sox catchers, Hatberg or Veritek, flash the signs. So still, the way she was standing now. All of that deep stillness seeming to somehow spin out around him from the shoulders. And then to the set and the motion. "He's got ice water in his veins," her dad said. She wanted to get out of here, out of this nasty swamp to start with, and then out of the damned woods altogether. Wanted to get back to where there were people and stores and malls and phones and policemen who would help you if you lost your way. And she thought she could, if she could be brave. If she had just a little of the old ice water in her veins. Breaking out of her own stillness, Trisha took off her other Reebok and knotted the laces of both sneakers together. She hung them around her neck like cuckoo clock pendulums, debated over her socks, and decided to leave them on as a kind of compromise. As an oog shield was the thought that actually went through her mind. She rolled the cuffs of her jeans up to her knees, then took a deep breath and let it out. "McFarland whines, McFarland pitches," she said. She resettled her socks cap, backward this time because backward was cool, and started moving again. Trisha stepped from hummock to hummock with careful deliberation, looking up frequently and snatching little glances, setting a landmark and then moving toward it, just as she had yesterday. Only today I'm not going to panic and run, she thought. Today I've got ice water in my veins. An hour passed, then 2. Instead of firming, the ground grew boggier. Finally, there was no solid ground at all, except for the hummocks. Trisha went from one to the next, steadying herself with branches and bushes where she could, holding her arms out for balance like a tightrope walker where there was nothing good to hold on to. Finally, she came to a place where there was no hummock within jumping distance. She took a moment to steel herself, and then stepped into the stagnant water, startling up a cloud of water bugs and releasing a stench of peaty decay. The water was not quite up to her knees. The stuff her feet were sinking into felt like cold, lumpy jelly. Yellowish bubbles rose in the disturbed water. Swirling in them were black fragments of who knew what. "Gross," she moaned, moving forward toward the nearest hummock. "Oh, gross. Gross, gross, gross. Gag maggot." She walked in lurching forward strides, each ending in a hard yank as she pulled her foot free. Gosh, makes me feel tired just reading it. She tried not to think of what would happen if she couldn't do that, if she got stuck in the bottom ooze and started to sink. Gross, gross, gross. It had become a chant. Sweat ran down her face in warm droplets and stung in her eyes. The crickets seemed stuck on one high, endless note. Ree! Wow, that was really awful. Sorry. I tried. Ahead of her, on the hummock which was her next stop, 3 frogs jumped out of the grass and into the water. Plip, plip, plop. Why are there so many onomatopoeias? Bud. Why, Zer, Trisha said, and smiled wanly. There were tadpoles by the thousands, swimming in the yellow-black murk around her. As she looked down at them, one of her feet encountered something hard and covered with slime. A log, maybe. Trisha managed to flounder over it without falling and reach the hummock. Gasping, she pulled herself up and looked anxiously at her mud-slimy feet and legs, half expecting to see bloodsuckers or something even worse squirming all over them. There was nothing awful that she could see, at least, but she was covered in crud right up to her knees. She peeled off her socks, which were black, and the white skin beneath looked more like socks than her socks did. This caused Trisha to laugh maniacally. She lay back on her elbows and howled at the sky, not wanting to laugh like that, like insane people. A total idiot, but for a while she couldn't stop. When she was finally able to, she wrung her socks out, put them back on, and got up. She stood with her hand shielding her eyes, picked out a tree with a large lower branch broken off and dangling in the water, and made that her next goal. McFarland whines, McFarland pitches, she said tiredly, and started off again. She was no longer thinking about berries. All she wanted now was to get out of here in one piece. There is a point at which people who are cast upon their own resources stop living and begin merely surviving. The body, with all its freshest sources of energy exhausted, falls back on stored calories. Sharpness of thought begins to dull. Perception begins to both narrow and grow perversely bright. Things get wiggy around the edges. Trisha McFarland approached this borderline between life and survival as her second afternoon in the woods wore on. That she was now moving due west did not trouble her much. She thought, probably correctly, that moving consistently in one direction was good. The best she could do. She was hungry, but for the most part not very aware of it. She was concentrating too fiercely on keeping to a straight line. If she started to wander off to the left or right, she might still be in this stink hole when it started to get dark, and she couldn't stand that idea. Once she did stop to drink from her water bottle, and around 4 o'clock she drank the rest of her surge, almost without realizing it. The dead trees began to look less and less like trees and more like gaunt sentinels, standing with their gnarled feet in the still black water. Be seeing faces in them again pretty soon, she thought. While wading past one of these trees, there were no hummocks for almost 30 feet in any direction. She tripped over another submerged root or branch, and this time sprawled full length, splashing and gasping. She got a mouthful of gritty, silty water and spat it out with a cry. She could see her hands in the dark water. They looked yellowish and tallowy, like things long drowned. She pulled them out and held them up. "I'm all right," Trish said rapidly, and she was almost aware of crossing some vital line, could almost feel herself going over into some other country where the language was different and the money was funny. Things were changing. "But I'm all right. Yeah, I'm all right." And her pack was still dry. That was important because her Walkman was inside, and now her Walkman was her only link to the world. Filthy, now soaked all down her front, Trisha pushed onward. The new landmark was a dead tree that split halfway up and became a black letter Y against the declining sun. She moved toward it. She came to a hummock, glanced at it briefly, and waded on through the water instead. Why bother? Wading was quicker. Her revulsion at the cold, decayed jelly on the bottom had faded. You could get used to anything if you had to. She knew that now. Well, I've only got a few seconds left of footage for this, so I'm going to wrap it up here. Hope you don't mind my stumbling and random comments. See you in the next one. Love you guys. Bye.